Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar today. The topic of today's webinar is Inventory Management System, in short PIH Information Center, IMS, in short PIC, unit subcategories and approvals. Going forward, I will just refer to PIC systems. And today we will go over the PHA Occupancy Technical Assistance webinar for this brand new PIH notice 2021-35. Next slide, please. Who do we have here today? We are here from Innovative Emergency Management, and my name is Siglinde Chambliss, and I will walk you through the presentation today. Please ask questions. We have some polls for you. Please participate, identify in your Q&A your questions, and we'll be happy to answer as many as possible today. Our learning objectives are increased understanding of the HUD PIH Notice 2021-35 for unit subcategories, and then walk away with an increased understanding of the approval process. Next slide, please. We do have some housekeeping rules. This is a webinar, so therefore remain muted during the webinar unless invited to unmute. Questions can be entered in the Q&A section throughout the presentation and will be addressed at intervals during the webinar or at the end, so please familiarize yourself with the screen. I think the past 2 years has taught us enough how to use these functions and tools, but orient yourself real quick and find where your Q&A is. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the HUD Exchange website at a later date. So you can always go back and refer back to this particular session. Next slide, please. All right, the biggest slide deck. Cover page, unit status, category, and subcategory. Let us start. All right, what is this about? The categories are the status of the unit in the Inventory Management System, PIH Information Center, IMS-PIC. But again, going forward, we just refer to as PIC. HUD has established 4 major categories, as you can see on this particular slide. And it talks about the category for occupied, vacant, HUD approved, and non-dwelling. But each one of those has their own nuances or differences. The occupied units really refer to the units that are occupied and under lease to an eligible family for which the PHA successfully submitted a record using the PIC system. We also refer to this as the 505.8 or the MTW module. The vacant units are really unoccupied dwelling units that do not house the families that participate in the public housing program and do not fit into the category of the unit HUD approved vacancy subcategory. However, we also have what's referred to as vacant HUD approved, and those units in particular require the PHA to request an approval letter from the HUD field office and request a change in PIC. And we will go into more detail about this. Non-dwelling units are literally housing authority, public housing units that are in the PHA inventory and may use for the purposes other than housing for an eligible low-income family that is not used for those purposes. So we will go into those categories, what those could be. Next slide, please. Here we are showing you again the classification in the PIC system and giving you additional context to the subcategories, major category versus subcategory. In the occupied category, we have your assistant tenant, the employee, the non-assistant tenant over income, a police officer, or MTW neighborhood services. In your vacant or vacant HUD approved category, literally just vacant upon unit turn, undergoing modernization, court litigation, anything affected by natural disaster. We just had Hurricane Ian occur, so please keep that in mind. casualty loss, also potentially affected by Hurricane Ian, and market conditions for those long-term vacancies. In the non-dwelling bucket for subcategories, we have special use, anti-drug or crime, or what we call other special use self-sufficiency activity, and special use other resident activities when you have a tenant council or a RAD, MTW neighborhood services, the administrative uses, for example, a management office, or resident amenities when you use a unit to meet with residents. Next slide, please. Here you see probably the most important table that you can also see in reference to 2021-35 in table 1.0. Here we are essentially giving you the layout of the assistant tenant units on the side on the left, the categories, and whether a letter to HUD needs to be submitted, yes or no, and whether additional documentation may be required. It also gives you additional asterisks and information where we have a definition chart that is carved out for you that you can use as a quick checklist or check to refer back to, and whether these occupied units have a maximum term of an initial approved period. Remember, things are time stamped. Once it's approved, your clock starts ticking, and you need to keep a record when you may need to go back in for reapproval or not have additional approval at all in that category. Next section on the header says eligibility for full operating fund grant, your operating subsidy. Some of the units are exempted and you will not receive any operating subsidy too, whereas in some categories, you will receive operating subsidy. So please make sure that you always go back to that PIH notice and check that column and the effect on your operating subsidy as you make a change to unit category or unit subcategory status. And then whether you have eligibility for approval, the term, the length of time, and your regulation reference that you may need to brush up on and go back to, or if you're new to HUD, definitely need to become very familiar with reviewing and reading. Next slide, please. In the next vacant and vacant HUD approved, you can see where many of these require now HUD approval with the exception of the vacant unit, and the additional documentation that may be requested from you to provide to your field office. And typically this would occur through the letter and has to be very descriptive to provide additional context to the field office whether they're going to give you approval. The example of additional documentation as we list out here, very important and important at the local level, whether it needs to be approved in your PHA plan and your renewal process for the PHA plans and being subject to public notice. All this adds time and preparation for your staff to be familiar with these processes and when you can actually request something to be changed in PIC. So again, very time-driven, time-sensitive driven, and whether to what extent approval and documentation is required. In the maximum terms, you see many of these items are subject to 2 years or 3 years and have limitations, and whether operating subsidy will be provided. So you see in the vacant and vacant HUD approved, it's to your benefit to go through the exercise because all of these categories essentially provide some relief and operating funding to continue sustain the unit while you are working on your processes, to have all of that requested and you do your unit turn and you go through your procurement, for example, to undergo modernization. And then whether the eligibility for the approval terms, whether they will be extended or not extended. And you will see there's only 3 categories here for court litigation, natural disaster, and market condition, where you may request an extension for renewal of this particular category. Next slide, please. In the non-dwelling category, with the subcategories, the letter to the local field office to be acknowledged in PIC or approved, again, is required for all of these categories. That's to note, as well as documentation that may be requested from you to provide to your local HUD office. Documentation, as you see, when we look at, for example, the anti-drug crime, demonstrating in the plan that you use the unit on a regular basis, ongoing basis, not just once a month, twice a month, for your drug and crime prevention assistance or services to the residents in the surrounding neighborhood. What does that mean? So substations, for example, are perfect candidates because you make essentially a unit available for this for your police department or sheriff's department to occupy, be available. Although they may go there for rest, they're still accessible in the community. And you have to make sure that the activity provided in there has that particular access to your residents and your surrounding neighborhood. The maximum terms, as you can see, are very long. They go up to 5 years. These are considered more like permanent, almost like permanent outfits, so to speak, or could be, or at least with a longer time horizon, and that's why 5 years. And whether some of these units are subject to receipt for operating subsidy. You see here in this particular category, there are really only 2 types in the subcategory for non-dwelling that are not supported through operating subsidy, and that is for any type of administrative use, like putting a management office in there, or resident amenities. However, all of them can be renewed for extension as needed, and this is such a long period of time. So think about also in your office on where the data is located and whose function it will be to make sure to keep up with this kind of activity and validate whether the use of that particular subcategory for non-dwelling is still in that category and does not require an additional change in PIC. Next slide, please. This is the section on the asterisks that we saw in reference to the unit category and the unit subcategories. This just provides further context in regards to occupied units. What does it mean by definition? And additional reference to your regulation that you may need to read up to, and also providing a little bit more context to what it means for MTW neighborhood services when those are used. Since this particular PIH notice is applicable to both non-MTW as well as MTW, it's all combined into one. There's no special process for that. It's all into one particular PIH notice. Next slide, please. I want to pause and give the opportunity for some poll questions. Don't be afraid. This is your session. We are just basically asking for yes or no, and we will be able to see your peers probably have the same type of thoughts or questions that we are polling about. And it's good to hear from our peers whether they are really in the same boat as we all are. And checking in, especially as it appears after this long COVID period, we were just talking, we are really out of this cycle for about 2 years, what we consider like a normal cycle. So let's go on to our poll questions. Let's look at the next slide and see how you fare. These polls are only 1 minute long. Has your local heart office or PIC coach worked with you to update your information in PIC? Simple yes, no. Do you know the importance of the subcategories for funding? Yes, no. And were you able to make all your changes prior to the capital fund certification in PIC? Yes, no. And we just finished that exercise in August, which is a very important exercise to properly calculate our formula income associated with the capital fund program for these type of units. So again, very short poll, only 1 minute. We have about 10 more seconds to go. Click on one of the radio buttons, yes or no. Does it apply?
And when we're done with this poll, could we answer a few questions from the Q&A?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Great.
Thank you. Yes, I'm just waiting on the results. The poll closed. And I don't see the results as of yet, but we should be able to share momentarily before we open up for a Q&A. Oh, yeah. Okay. So we have registered 503 participants for today. And for the first question, working with your PIC coach in your local heart office, we have 174, so that's great news. And do you understand the importance of the subcategories for funding? Only 41, and no answers 280. So, oh, that was the first question. Sorry, I need to scoot down on the second question, the importance on the funding. 34, still low here as well. Were you able to make these changes prior to? Some sadly did not get this done before, so I hope we do have some HUD experts here that might be able to answer the question. If you had a little challenge and not be able to make those changes, whether you could still maybe get some of these changes in or not. And let's see, how do we want to handle the questions? Do we have some Q&A here? Let me see.
So there were a couple of folks who were asking for examples about court litigation. I'm not sure if you already went back and covered that.
Okay. We can go actually right into our PIH notice. And the PIH notice, this is an interesting one because this particular one was from an update from 2011. So it took about 10 years. I thought it was very well organized and it provides a lot of good context to the table 1.0 in this particular section. And let's see, court litigation, I'm going right into the notice. Vacant HUD approved, undergoing modernization. Court litigation. So literally in the regulation under 24 CFR, the Code of Federal Regulation, Title 24, paragraph 990, 145B, number 1. This is intended for units that must be vacant either due to litigation, meaning being with legal, such as a court order or settlement agreement that is legally enforceable, or units vacant in order to meet regulatory and statutory requirements to avoid potential litigation, and units under voluntary compliance. It's a lot of verbiage in here, but literally it's being held vacant as part of a court order, meaning you have been told as an authority until this particular litigation has been settled, this particular unit apparently has to be still kept for this particular tenant until all matters clear up. And so if you have any of this situation applied to you, you definitely receive or obtain an approval letter. Make your situation known to your field office, and I'm sure you have to provide all the legal write-up for that as well, and documentation from the courts before you have this particular item approved. I hope that will answer your question. This is kind of the long response, literally how it's intended per the PIH notice 2021-35.
Okay, so another question that was submitted is, if you have tenants that have not completed their recertification and are currently in court, can you ask permission to change the unit status to vacant? And will these tenants be removed from the EIV discrepancies?
That's a very good question. I think because we have HUD present as well, I would probably prefer for HUD to take their stance on it. It's always open to discussion. Do we have the opportunity for HUD to answer that question? If not, we want to make sure that we are not misguiding you in their interpretation of the notice. What we will do is take these additional questions and send them to HUD after this webinar, and then have the responses either sent to you directly or have them published through a Q&A. And we have actually at the end of this slide deck a Q&A email address for you where we will be able to follow up for you and give you the precise answer if it's not covered on the court litigation directly.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion, Sig. If there's questions we can't respond to immediately here, folks are welcome to submit via email to us.
Right.
A couple other questions are rolling in. I don't know if you want to take quite a few more questions. Do you want to continue to go through questions, or should we continue with the training here?
Well, I saw another, I do believe we have good time today, so we will try. I do see another one involving death, so we're definitely trying to get a most appropriate response for that situation as well. Anytime you have a death, you definitely have to change your status in PIC anyway. And I think this one will be more clear. Anytime you have death, you immediately update the status in PIC, and that will change the status of that unit anyway. I see another question here that says, if you have a tenant that have not complete the research, oh, that was the one we just talked about with the EIV discrepancy. What happens if construction work is not done in the 3 years to be vacant HUD approved for undergoing modernization? What we saw in the table, some are eligible to request extension. And let's see real quick what it says on the modernization as far as extension requests. It says 2 years. Yes, if construction is on schedule. So if there are circumstances that prohibit you from meeting the timeline, this is a perfect example. For example, right now with all the supply change and having delay in supply, as well as having a hard time actually getting with contractors and getting your procurement done because there is no availability of contractors, and as well as time delay for delivery of materials and services for that fact, although some are reporting not having enough employees to meet your time schedule, or it's just outpriced and you have to start new and fresh and rethink your plans. These are perfect examples to why seek additional extension, and it falls in the category for extensions. So definitely make your case. And it's like in a disaster, those are things that are sometimes out of your control, and give it a good try. All right, we will definitely make sure that we are going to address your questions after this particular webinar. and provide them to you in writing. So thank you again for providing them. Let's see how much time we have at the end and might be able to revisit. Let's go to the next slide, please, and move on. The next section is how to request a unit status change and HUD approval letter. So next slide. In the PHA notice, this particular approval protocol is reflected in section 5.2 of your PHA notice, so it will follow this particular section. It's rather short, not much to it. And as with everything, there is a protocol on how to go about these requests for changes. It definitely starts with a written request to the HUD field office. So know your field office. Usually it's addressed to the director or designee. It does not hurt to add your financial management analyst into the CC of this particular notice when you email it, because they are usually less busy or in the office, they're available for you and maybe pointing this out to the director that there is a notice there. Definitely be thorough in your explanation. The more you can recite back to federal regulation, an excerpt, or any extensive additional information that you have about the situation you want to provide, the more information you provide in context, the easier it will be for the staff to respond at the local HUD office. So typically we are going back to the what, where, why, and how, answer those kind of questions and in context of regulation. Provide a schedule for placing units back online into the occupied assistant tenant. It is critical that we know when units come back online, how long will it be not in occupancy. Those time lengths are very important because you know you are monitored on your occupancy percentage and have to meet those benchmarks, and therefore you want to ensure that you're able to speak to how long a unit will be offline. And then, of course, anything that is being requested from you, you may need to provide upfront, or you have follow-up as you write your unit status change request for additional required documentation. Just scan the whole package together and email it now with technology. Email it to your field office. That way you have it date and time stamped and clocked, and you can save it on your network, and it's accessible for you in a future date. What does the field office do? Well, they will determine, or they will review your request, and they will determine if actually this particular change is permitted. And again, a lot is already summarized for you in table 1.0 of this PIH notice, and that's essentially what the HUD staff will do. And they will go through your written request and determine, well, is it all appropriate? Does it all make sense? Should we approve this particular request? I have more questions. And then based on this review process, which may be a few emails offline back and forth, a decision will be reached whether the request will be approved or denied. What will be the next steps? Upon the receipt of the approval letter, the PHA can request a change in PIC, and then the system automatically generates an email to the field office that you have requested the change. And if submitted prior to receiving the approval letter, the request will be rejected and the PHA can be resubmitting the request. And it just adds length of time. So be aware, wait for your approval letter before you go to the next step and try to make those changes in PIC. And sometimes you will be asked, put the change in PIC and send me the approval letter. So work with your field office, you know the field office, and you can go from there and adjust. How long does it typically take? It typically takes up to 30 days. And from the date that the field office received your request and has made approval. So just laying it out simplistically into just those 4 bullets on what's happening. with your request. Next slide, please. Moving on to the section 5.3 in your PIH notice that we're covering today. And then most categories and subcategories require that the PHA to receive a signed HUD approved letter. So when you go big picture, what is needed in order to achieve these milestones or those steps, be aware that many of these categories require HUD approval letter. The approval letters identify the units affected, so be aware you have to give your AMP number, your asset management project number, AMP number, and you have to give the unit number affected and for the duration and approval of the term. So be very descriptive as far as length of time. The exception applies to the market conditions, which identify a percentage of the units that are impacted in market conditions that are requiring you essentially to have a contractor, or you have other outside factors that do not allow you to reoccupy the unit fairly quickly and bring it up to the status that you need to reoccupy. The approvals are subject to a number of years, as we have seen in the table. Some of them are 2, 3, and we have seen some up to 5 years. And again, the most important table in this PIH notice is really summarized in table 1.0. The HUD field office may require additional information and other milestones. They may have you write it out specifically, and if you can't meet those milestones, to why you can't meet those milestones and what changed your initial target date when it comes to those renewals for unapproved vacancies. And without sufficient cause, if a milestone cannot be met, the HUD field office will not approve the request. Again, the intent of housing authorities is to provide and make available units to tenants to occupy in this period of time where many individuals, even still after COVID, come out and will be affected or have been affected due to homelessness. It is the goal to always look at the public housing units and ensure that we are able to meet the HUD standard for occupancy. And by the way, that's a good segue. We have an additional webinar coming up to further dive into occupancy and the effects and scoring. So it's all about the goal, meeting the authorities' occupancy requirements for HUD standards. Next slide, please. All right. How to obtain a HUD user approval in PIC. We thought it's a good idea to just briefly walk through the PIC. PIC in itself has a very descriptive, laid out guidebook. We have at the end of this presentation for you resources that are those are links. So those links, once you receive the PowerPoint, you can go and click on and save to your favorites, but definitely the PIC guidebook is going to be your friend, has pictures step by step. The guidebook is excellent. And then you can follow the instructions before you even reach out to your PIC coordinator. But once your user is logged into PIC, you essentially select your development submodule on the left side. We have a picture on the next slide. We will show you shortly. And you will be selecting your PIC main page. You have drop-down boxes available, and you can select from your profile the field office physical development containing the unit you wish to designate. So it's all driven by your AMP asset management project. And you go into drop-down and you select the development you want. We will see that in the screenshot, the next slide. Let's go to that real quick. Next slide. Picture is a little small, but this kind of gives you a visual once you logged into PIC. And for those that are PIC users, this is very familiar to you. I hang out in the development section quite often just to check the status, especially what's on the ACC for funding. But you see up at the top, there's a unit tab, and there essentially you will be making your changes, or you can see the status of the unit based on the 505.8 that's been submitted in the system right away. And periodically, you definitely want to go through these particular screens and check and validate that it's actually consistent with your rent register, really. If you see something vacant and you look at your vacancy report out of your other system that you're using and it doesn't reconcile, then obviously some changes got behind. And we do know that periodic notices are coming out and say, hey, your occupancy is at this level, and I show this from the hot field office. I show this as part of vacant, and please help me identify when you will reoccupy. So the reconciliation between PIC and the 505.8 is important, whether you do that at your level at the housing authority with your own staff, or you have a subcontractor helping you in that regard that will make those submissions for you. But again, on the unit tab, very important tab, where you can quickly see what's happening. Let's go to the next tab. We have another screenshot. And here you can see the unit tenant status. You can make the modification, that red box, when you follow that, whether you need to modify it. And again, the PIC guidebook has step-by-step. This is just an example showing you in a little bit more detail what to look for. Next slide. We have another picture. Oh, no picture, done. From what we did not want to do here, because this is not a PIC training session, we did not take the time to put more of the sample pictures in there, but it's a very important factor to go to your PIC guidebook and work with your PIC coach to become familiar, and if needed, request additional PIC training. But the drop-down boxes make it very easy for you to change unit designations, and some, again, do not require HUD approval. And the selection reason for unit designation are easily identified, that are readily available for you, that you wish to change it to. And then most importantly, when you go through all of this, never forget to click the Save button for your unit designation that do not require HUD approval, or your proposed change that do require HUD approvals. For the unit designation that require the HUD approvals, you do have to submit your change request to HUD. This is just a reminder on what we had discussed in an earlier slide for your approval process. And then definitely click on your submission tab and submit the unit status change sub-tab, and then click on the submit data for approval. Again, this is just like sort of cliff notes from a very extensive PIC guidebook, and definitely recommend to go through the guidebook and seek out your PIC coach if you're not quite comfortable or familiar with this particular area. Next slide, please. All right. Unit status categories, subcategories, section 5.4. This particular section 5.4, we cannot do it all justice in the PIH notice. It's very extensive and descriptive in the PIH notice, and we can only highlight in this particular webinar, but there are special instructions related to unit status categories. We definitely ask you to refer back to 5.4, because in this particular section on the occupied, when you go into the subcategories on the type of occupied, whether it's an assistant tenant and an employee, or a non-assistant for over income, or police officers, it's so extensive that we cannot overload the PowerPoint with that, but it's highly recommended that you take your time and read through those categories. The takeaway that I have with the police officer, you definitely must have approval letters for this particular subcategory and submit to the HUD field office for approval. You must meet your substantive requirements of the unit tenant's status subcategory for the entire period, and that is in that subcategory in PIC. So that's a highlight takeaway for this particular category. And then each category corresponds to one of the 4 categories. The notice is very well organized when you go into this section of 5.4. 5.41 would be the occupied. 5.42 would be the vacant. 5.43 would be the vacant HUD approved. And then the 5.4 for non-dwelling. Unless we have very specific questions, we definitely will try to quickly go and glance into the PIH notice and try to answer some questions on the fly. But it is over like 3 pages, very extensive, and definitely something to take time and read and interpret with the staff together what it means for your situation at your authority. Next slide, please. Section 6. So in the section 6, and Helena, you tell me if there are additional questions, if you want me to just pause for a minute before we go into section 6.
Sure. A lot of these are very specific questions, so I'm asking folks to go ahead and submit them via email, but there were a few folks from the top of the presentation asking about some examples of what qualifies as market conditions.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you know what? That is a good section. So let's see what HUD has to say about market conditions, right? And so in this particular section of the market conditions, again, it very well organized, but it refers you back, and I recommend that you read the terminology first. You go into your Title 24 Code of Federal Regulation, paragraph 990, 240, and 245. But market conditions can be accepted or can be appealed for an entire portfolio. I'll read here. And here, it's really to, how difficult will it be to occupy your units? And it could be also changing in your surroundings in your area. Market conditions such as your own marketing and outreach and your wait list. And this is a good segue here also with wait list and the next webinar that we're talking about occupancy and scoring and the challenges on market conditions that are not just related to when we think about damaging of the units, but it's really an area experiencing population loss or economic dislocations. The example that is listed in the PIH notice talks about qualifying economic dislocation would include oversaturation of affordable housing. I don't think we even have that category. I don't think there's not enough affordable housing. Market obsolescence of the public housing property as compared to the competing properties. When you have a lot of new development going on, you see your wait list has not been filling up with interested individuals because they rather like to go to newer developments if they can afford the rents, or other circumstances that create the lack of demand for affordable housing. It could be related and associated with crime, and for the portfolio to essentially affect or impact the ability of the market to lease up the units. And that could be a variety of things: loss of business in the surrounding area, not needing the housing that used to be occupied, when you have a major industry leaving the area, lots of rebuilding with newer, more appealing, as we just discussed. Or it could also be when you have, in hindsight, of a disaster, and you have a complete lack of your housing is destroyed, not just aged, but also destroyed, economic factors that you cannot control. So increased unemployment is another one that's listed. We had that experience during the COVID period. And when you have an increase in population of low-income households in the community, but it's an increasing demand, but your housing stock is not ready to occupy them. So changes in market conditions can be a wide variety. And again, it's limited to 2 years. And sometimes a good discussion with the local HUD office or your field office is important to have, to see what else you could do to meet the demand for occupancy that is expected. Do we have another one that we can cover, Helena?
Yeah, I think we've got a couple more that hopefully we can just answer on the fly here. Someone was asking about more detail about a preferred format of additional documentation for non-dwelling units.
Oh, that's a good one too. You know, one thing I can definitely tell you, every field office is different. It starts out with the letter and in depth of the documentation, but I would definitely hash it out when it comes to these kind of, like, how much is enough, or how much information is necessary to be provided. Sometimes it's a fine line. You need to have it approved. So sometimes it's just literally just following the instructions, what in particular the field office is looking for. I have not seen where it's so descriptive that says you must provide 1, 2, 3. I have not seen that. So maybe this is another good question, Helena, that we might be able to get an answer from the HUD office as far as what is expected, like the minimum expected, right?
Yep, and I think you're right that the field office would be a good place also to see, for them to reach out to their field office to see what the expectation is.
Right, and you have all these peers here as well. If there's somebody that might be able to share and say, hey, when I had this category for non-dwelling, I always provided this particular information. I always was successful in having that done. Reach out to your peers in your area and ask them specifically. You can always learn and engage with your peers in your area or another state to just reach out. But for non-dwellings, I usually just write up the argument and provide maybe an evidence. When you think about it, if the non-dwelling is associated with police, that kind of makes it easier because you can have a written statement and support from your police department that says, effective this date, this is what I'm doing for the particular community in this particular address, which is the address associated with the public housing unit. So that may be just an easier example.
Thanks. We also have someone with their hand up. I'm not sure if they want to ask a question and unmute. Is Michelle Dow? You want to unmute yourself and ask a question? You're welcome to. Okay, maybe the hand's up just by accident. Sometimes you just hit the wrong button.
All right, no problem. I see we're actually good on time, so I can go into section 6.
Great.
High price. So let me go into the right spot of the PIH notice. It helps to walk right along this particular section. So it's a rather short section too, but packed. PHA must update PIC in development submodule data no later than 60 calendar days from the effective date of the unit status change. So whenever you want it, you need 60 days prior, because we already learned HUD field office can give 30 days, and it takes time to complete the whole process. So really on the calendar, maybe it should be 90 days. Mark it on the calendar as an interval, as an annual thing or biannual thing, that you need to review this, and you should have it done at least 60 days prior to. But that's the expectation, and that's how it's written in the notice. Late request approvals could affect operating fund and capital fund formula. We just learned that August is always the month that we certify our capital fund data. So we certify that the unit status information is actually accurately reflected in PIC. Based on that information, your operating subsidy will roll off when we do this exercise in February for the calendar year, the following February. So we did August, and then around February, we start the operating subsidy process. It will pull that data. And for the capital fund program, it will pull the data a little earlier because October 1 is the federal fiscal year begin. So the data that's reflected in the system will pull over to actually help calculate how much funds need to be set aside for your authority related to capital fund activity based on that unit status. So keep that in mind as we're working with different periods of calendar year and federal fiscal years, and when this particular data is needed. Your 505(8) submissions, they must be no later than 60 calendar days from the effective date of any action. So PIC data, again, is driven by your 5/8s and your 5/9s, as we HUD, as we housers say, we have 5/8s and 5/9s. We skip the 500 number part, but 5/8 being public housing and 5/9 section 8. So we just know what we're referring to on these forms, and that it's recommended that if you want a June or earlier effective date, you need to work or have this particular information on the unit status change for example, the example that we are providing is new admissions record that when transmitted will designate as unit occupied by assistant tenant, and that should be by August 29th. So the 60 days after June the 30th to ensure accurate operating funding. So if we want the funding right, we need to make sure we work backwards. I don't know how many financial people we have here in this webinar and how many individuals from the housing operations, but working closely also with finance can help look into information or can assist you with the information or help you with the timelines when activities are due or when they do stuff. So you can be cognizant of that and work with them, and finance would not be surprised, but why did my subsidy change? Have a dialogue with your finance folks internally and keep them abreast to let them know, hey, we made all these requests and we are anticipating the net effect on the formula income to be approximately X amount of values. It can be X amount of dollars. It can be calculated, but it's a good idea to work with your finance people. And then I'm referencing back here is going back to your slide 14, where you actually indicate on how you change the units, but your PIC guidebook is your official guidebook on that. Let's go into the next section. Next slide. Section 7, very short, only one paragraph in the PIH notice for the changes when it comes to demolition and disposition on special instructions. It does work a little bit differently. So once you make your request for demolition disposition in your system, the unit is automatically placed in PIC into this status. So once your application is filed, it will sort of like lock it, right? Units cannot be placed in this particular status manually. Units approved for home ownership that are not occupied by an assistant tenant should be manually classified in the vacant unit tenant status. The PHA must direct all requests to place units in demo dispo category through your HUD Special Application Center or SAC. And you know they have been improving their turnaround time as well. It rather goes very swift. Within 30 days, you have this completed in your system. If you have a change to a unit that is placed in demo dispo, you actually also need to contact back your SAC office, take that off temporarily, make your change in the system if it's still occupied because you have moved the tenants off, and then let the SAC office know, hey, I made my change, and you can lock it back again. So it's a little bit coordination required here. And then, of course, the SAC has detailed procedural guidance for demolition, disposition, inventory removal. A link is provided for you here that is actually in the PIH notice. When you click on it, it will take you directly there. And of course, we have many different reasons for demolition and disposition. It's not just disposition for demolition, or it could be disposition to do a conversion, RAD conversions. All of these processes are affected by this 4-pick. Okay. Do we have any questions for those areas like the 6 and the 7? Did any additional new questions come up in that area?
I'm not seeing anything specific to those topics.
Okay, sounds good.
The chat is very busy, so I'm trying to keep up.
I see the question and answers, very busy. I'm sorry, as I'm speaking off, I can't quite keep up with it, so thank you, appreciate it.
Here's a question you might be able to answer, Sig. One person submitted a question noting that they have several tenants who are currently in rehabilitation facilities due to illness. They've tried to get them to do re-exam packets and have not been successful. And they've continued to pay rent, but they're concerned about their 5/8 submissions being late. Any comments, thoughts, advice on that?
Well, my first thought was going to, if the individual themselves are not available, you know, the point of contact information in a tenant record, hopefully there is a legal guardian or some sort of designee that can assist with this particular request, or advocacy group that they can facilitate the process if there's nobody in the family that can help with that, to get the information that they need. When the rent is paid, I don't know, personally, when the rent is paid, the money is in the bank, the unit is in their name. It's really more about what happens when the tenant doesn't come back and the rent is not paid, right? Because until such time, the legal possession is in the tenant's name. They have not terminated the lease. The rent is paid. The unit is not, as long as no complaints, no unauthorized visitors are in the unit. I don't think there is, I don't want to speak here in the legal. I think this is another good feedback for HUD on their position, but you know, everything has been, what I see or mentioned, is complied with.
One individual here has chimed in suggesting that maybe just taking a look at the ACOP to see if they can start legal proceedings if they're out of the unit over 6 months. So thank you for that comment. There was another question about court litigation again. Someone was asking if that status can be used when they are evicting tenants or only when the unit has been locked and we have to comply with a court order to keep their belongings.
I interpret it to be a court order and you can't remove the belongings, but that's another good follow-up for HUD to give the proper legal context around that particular question. Because until the belongings, until you actually get the vacate order and the sheriff shows up and you can take legal possession of the unit, then until such time it's under court order, right? But it's another good, let's make sure that we have legal input and see, and I'm sure housing authorities handle it differently from jurisdiction to jurisdiction potentially. And we want to make
It's
sure.
sounding like HUD's chiming in here in the chat and saying that your answer was correct.
Oh, good.
So thank you.
I have enough
Just
legal
scrolling through to see if
background
there's
to cover
anything
that.
else here. Nothing else is jumping out at me that we didn't kind of already touch upon. Apologies to anyone who submitted a question that maybe I missed. I tried to respond to everybody. Oh, here's one. There was a question early on about the category non-assisted tenant over income. Is that the same as families considered over income under the HOTMA over income rule?
I hope so. Because the HOTMA rule was the latest rule. Let me see what it says here. We're quickly perusing through if I can spot it fairly quickly. Non-assistant tenant over income. All right, let's see. Going right into the notice. Again, I don't want to take things out of context here. So it's just essentially referring to annual income exceeds the limit for a low-income family at the time, so we all understand that. However, there are exceptions for PHAs with less than 250 units who may admit over-income families as initial occupancy subject to the conditions, and it refers us to the regulation 24 CFR 96503. So in order to really be more precise about this, we have to go back to 96503, read that first for this particular category. A non-assistant tenant over income units may be leased in accordance with the terms outlined in the PHA plan. So what does your annual plan say in regards to non-qualified individuals and your 5-year plan for qualified PHAs? And you must have a written approval letter from your field office to place units in this particular category. So it's not like we're saying you can't have over income, but you know, any over income individual takes away from an individual that needs housing, that cannot meet that is below income. So it refers essentially back to what is your policy at your agency level. Okay. Anything else? If not, we're moving on to the next slide. And I think the next polls is coming up. Let's see. Next slide, please. Yes, poll questions. All right. Well, we are asking, are you comfortable with the new process for approval? Yes, no. This update, again, was long overdue. It's 10 years. It's very well described and identified. We are again providing the poll option for 1 minute. It's just simply yes, no's. We'd like to hear from you. And you have definitely tools, references, the webinar. We will definitely get to your Q&As, especially after the webinar, and have something back in writing for you. And it's something that, you know, the more you do it, the better you get at it. Second question is, have you experienced issues or acceptance from your local HUD office to process your request? So we'd like to hear a little bit about that. And do you feel you need training or refresher? And it comes necessarily more so to individual persons and or the PIC system, any of that, or just the PIH notice in itself, although this webinar is supposed to facilitate that, but sometimes a more one-on-one is necessary, so don't be shy about that. These are just simple yes, no. The minute was passed. Hope you got a chance to do that, and we're waiting for the results of this particular poll. Not quite yet. All right. First question, are you comfortable with the new process? So we really have 20% out of the total pool. And in the second question, have you experienced issues at the local level? So many of you did not answer. I see this as a mixed bag. No, 81, and yes, 42. So for those that had issues, I would recommend an open dialogue and assess what are you looking for in particular. Be honest about the conversation. The process can be frustrating. Help me clarify. Do you have a good sample template from another housing authority that we can redact the information, but I can follow the outline that would be helpful? I don't know, things like that. You can always ask and be denied, but check with the housing authority how your peers and your partners are handling that. And refreshers, yes, no, mixed bag. I know it's a lot. If you have access to your own legal counsel, that's also a good start to be able to dissect the language of a federal regulation, the interpretation, how far you can stretch it, or what does it mean? Where are my boundaries? Where can you go? Reading, getting comfortable in your regulation and referencing it side by side with your PIH notice, make reference. This is when, paper, I guess, still helps when you print it out and you use your different highlighter and codes and kind of create your own little checklist for the staff when those situations arise, how you want to raise the flags on when to change unit status categories. Just a few tips in that regard. But I appreciate your answering the questions in the poll. Next page. Where can I find my field office point of contacts? Once you get those slides, the link is right there. You type in your jurisdiction and it will give you the area who you can call. What I've referred to, who are my Ghostbusters. Where can I find my PIC user guide? We felt this is definitely going hand in hand with this PIH notice and will be your friend. So you should have this link and save it in your favorites. Next slide. Your references that we are providing to you as part of this webinar. We have, of course, the PIH notice, the direct link to that. Your regulation, Part 990, because it is part of the PIH notice references. So you want to make sure that you also check in your link in your favorites that particular section of the Code of Federal Regulation. Your accounting brief, 17, that is mentioned in the PIH notice. And then your special SAC application office, we have that link for you, as well as how to, the instructions on the unit status change, how to submit that, the PDF that was provided. So that is your resources and references for you. So you have something in your toolbox. Next slide, please. Q&A, we handled some. We do have a few more minutes if you want to take 5 minutes. If there's anything else, if anybody wanted to raise their hand and had something that they wanted to share with the group, now is your moment. We love to hear from you. Don't be shy. If we have one of that, we'd love to hear from you. If not, next slide will give us the email address, and I think it was answered in the Q&A where to send those to. Can we see the next slide? Additional questions? Definitely follow up with us. Send your TA service request to hudcc.trainings@iem.com. In the subject line, please reference PHA Occupancy TA post-training follow-up questions so they can be filtered out real quick. And please include in your body of the email the requester name, the requesting authority, the training topic, today's training, specific issue or any other question, and then your email and phone number so we can follow up in case we need clarity in regards to the question. And with that, this concludes our today's session, the webinar. We appreciate your attendance today. We hope we were able to give you additional clarity and give you enough resources and materials for more reading, right, that we need. But it's an important topic. It's tied to funding, and it's an important topic that we need to understand to maximize our receipt of funding, but also to improve our scoring, which we will cover in an additional webinar session. So we look forward to seeing you again or hearing you again in our follow-up webinars regarding occupancy topic. With that, today's training concluded. And again, thank you on behalf of the team for your attendance today. I know you could have done more things, but you were listening to this particular webinar, and we appreciate it. Have a great day.